are going to talk about sensitive topics. Please do disclaimer before you start your speech, not during your speech. And lastly, POI is not mandatory, but it's highly encouraged. I hope everyone's here. All the teams are perfect. Are complete already. But in regard to that, yeah, I'll be asking for consent to be live stream as well. OG, are you guys here and complete? And do you consent?
Here, Eloisa, are you here? Hello? Okay, I think, let me just message Eloisa, sorry.
All right, thank you. Let's wait for OG. But anyhow, opening opposition, they're here and complete, and they also consent. Closing government, you guys here and complete, and you consent to being live streamed on Facebook.
We're now complete. Yes, we consent.
All right, thank you so much. And lastly, closing up, same question.
We both consent. Yes.
All right, thank you so much. Let's wait for opening government for their um, answer.
I don't consent, but I don't know about my partner.
All right,
Eloisa?
all right, let's wait for them.
Hello, I don't consent either.
All right, so everyone consents except opening government to be live streamed on Facebook. So I think we're already set. Debating, debating with the motion in light of efforts toward de-Dutertification. This House believes that characterizing Duterte supporters as victims does more harm than good. To open this debate, calling on Prime Minister here.
Hello, am I audible?
But regardless of that, let's call on LO to start the clash on opposition. Here.
Hi, wait. Just give me like 1 moment. I just need to set up.
Sure, take your time.
Okay. Just checking if I'm. Wait, am I visible? I hope I'm visible.
Yes, you're visible and audible.
Okay, great. Let me just set up my timer. Before that, people ask me for shout outs. So I'm just gonna like divulge. I will only take 30 seconds. So shout out to CDS, Kyunja, Romel, Leia. Shout out to Talaxic, Mario, Steph, Jehai, Denise, Kurt. Shout out to Harvest Debate Union. I'm not gonna name all of you. Shout out to HDS CTGC. Shout out to CDU CTGC. Shout out to my seniors in Nantugi. Shout out OC. Shout out everyone in this debate. And last one, I watched a Luigi lecture the night before this. Okay, so Haleigh, she, her, POIs through voice at the 5th-minute mark ideally. I hope no one interrupts me. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Duterte is our common enemy, not the people within our own country, not our fellow kababayans who live across us from the street. A few things then, but firstly, let's directly call out that opening government's case is basically just ours, because if they say that, oh, these Duterte, like DDS supporters are victims of misinformation or victims of circumstance, then that's literally just what you're doing, that you're painting them as victims, you're conceding to us. And secondly, they have to paint the alternative as to what necessarily the counterfactual to not paint as like, what do we do if we don't paint them as victims? They have to talk about that, because absent that, the efforts of De-Dutertification is not going to be successful anymore. 2 points of setup. First, we know that De-Dutertification is done by the progressive left opposition in the Philippines because we want to offset all of the harmful principles set in place by Duterte in governments and in society. But secondly, the extent of it currently is just relatively surface level because of the way that we treat these people in status quo, where we deem them as our enemies, we deem them as lost cases, where we're always just fighting with them in the Facebook comments, we always just have posts talking about why EJK is bad and they comment on that rashly, and simply just that we aren't able to humanize the discussion with them, and we're not able to talk about them properly. We think 3 things that firstly, Duterte had 3 things that people necessarily like. Firstly, that he was a strong man, he was the Superman, he was going to save us from all of the problems that we had in status quo. Secondly, that you would have better Visman representation in national policy making, because before Duterte became president, we were hardly ever consulted. And thirdly, people felt safe during his term. How do we necessarily dismantle all of these things, and how do we effectively Dutertify, and what necessarily does characterizing them as victims actually look like? Probably it looks like, first, we tell people that they are victims of the manipulation by the Duterte camp, and that secondly, they had to make these decisions because of their circumstances. Yes, we agree with OG that these people are probably rational enough to know what these decisions were. They probably knew that they probably knew the kinds of decisions and the kinds of discourse that they were like participating in. But the reasons to why they did that is important for you to understand, because they did not just simply do this because they wanted to go against all of their fellow kababayan. They did this out of circumstance. What then is the argument coming from opening opposition? It's simply that painting them as victims has done more good for 3 reasons. Because firstly, the extent of idolatry created a systemic problem, and it recognizes that there is a systemic problem within our political landscape, that we always constantly idolize politicians, and we always constantly put them at this place where we should always patronize them for all of the good that they do for our country. And this is true because you already see this being established way back in the Spanish regime and way back in American regime, where they would always present themselves as quote-unquote heroes. Duterte was able to strategically position himself in that way, and being able to paint them as victims, it allows us to be able to recognize that this is what is going on in our system currently, and we ought to rectify that. The second argument is that we don't demonize an entire population, and this is important, right? Because DDS supporters make up the majority of our population. Arguably, most of them come from Visman communities. We have to recognize that there are educational gaps and a lack of opportunities that
Yeah.
populations are able to have. These are systemic issues. They are victims of circumstance. Principally, you ought not to demonize them because they had to make these decisions because of their circumstances. They had to vote for these policies. They had to choose them because of their circumstances, and because they were led to believe that these policies, that these beliefs are things that will benefit them in the long run, when in actuality they have become victims of these policies as well. This is already principally winning, and it's prerequisite to whatever closing opposition is going to talk about, because you have to principally understand why you ought not to demonize these people in order to understand why in the first place we want to like paint them as victims. I said at the fifth. Nextly, the counterfactual is far worse, and if this comes out at DPM, it's far too late already for opening government, because what happens when we don't victimize them? We demonize them, we view them as our enemies. What happens then is in places like discourse, these discourses are always going to be filled with ad hominems. We throw below the belt insults, or even then these people go to the extremes because you deem them as lost cases and you constantly insult each other. You're likely going to be harassed, you're going to be doxxed. Everyone
Yeah.
is simply just pitting themselves against each other without genuinely realizing that the problem is not within ourselves, the problem is the system, and the problem is Duterte. But okay, I'll take a point.
Surely you can invest in educational infrastructures in area with no diversity of thought, independent of you painting these DDS supporters as not victims. Surely you can do that on your side.
Yeah, of course we can do that on our side, but you have to do that but you have to paint them as victims to be able to recognize that there is a need for that in the first place, and you aren't able to make them realize that hey, your education systems weren't that great, that hey, you weren't able to have all of the opportunities that you needed to have. You were a victim of circumstance. You need these people to realize that in order for your De-Dutertification to be successful in these areas. You cannot say on neither government bench that you're willing to take that, oh, we're going to view them as enemies. You cannot say that it's that is a trade-off that you're willing to take, because firstly, these people make up the majority of the population. Likely, if you do not do that, they're still going to vote another Duterte in place. You're going to experience the same cycle all over again. Secondly, it does more harm to the left insofar as these people are capable of being able to utilize their resources against you because we deem each other as enemies. They're likely going to harm you, they're likely going to harass you, and those are things that the left cannot afford to happen. Insofar as we need to also be able to capitalize our resources into ensuring that we actually do unite together against the common enemy that is Duterte. You have to talk about this, because absent this, the efforts of De-Dutertification are unsuccessful, and that is the most important thing that you ought to prioritize in this debate. So ultimately, right, two things already that opening opposition does, and why they already directly respond to the entirety of government mention, why we already preempt closing. Because firstly, we give to you the context as to why necessarily these people had to make these choices in the first place, and why there is a necessity for them to be seen as victims, and why it's necessary to paint them as victims, and why this has done more good than harm. Because insofar in current status quo, where we continuously view them as enemies, where we always pit each other against each other, we have not gotten any progress at all. The De-Dutertification effort is not working because this is how we are operating. Yeah, so long as we are able to tell them that hey, what happened to you did not deserve to happen to you. We ought to unite together to ensure that this never happens to you again, that you get the resources and you get the opportunities that you need in life again. So long as we're able to paint this picture to them, we're able to ensure that one, De-Dutertification is something that's going to be likely more successful, because now they realize as well that hey, Duterte is not the Superman that you think he is. And that secondly, you're able to actually unite and like share resources to be able to ensure that you have these educational reforms, because insofar as if you do not get this, and it's already a response to the POI, if you're unable to get the support from these people in the first place, you're not able to get any of that reform anyway. So uniquely, Duterte is the enemy. It is not your fellow kababayans. It is not the people on the street. It is not my mom in my house who supports Duterte. They are not the enemy. It ought to be Duterte. We are all victims of circumstance. For all of those reasons, oppose.
Thanks for that speech, Leader of Opposition. Now to continue the case coming from OG, calling on DPM here.
I'll just set my timer. Give me a moment. Okay. Just arranging my notes. While I do that, some shout outs, I guess. Shout out to OC. Love you all, UPC kids and the rest of the group debating. Top Joris. Shout out to my partner, Haleigh, one of my children. To the rest of the children, everything we do hopefully is for you. Shout out to all the DDS supporters. Yeah, shout out to Lantugi. Shout out to everyone, I guess. Sorry, this is not a proper shout out. Starting my speech. In 3, 2. Non-TDS supporters says that Visaya are stupid, that Duterte supporters made an active choice to idolize him because that's just who they are. That's a rationality that DPM was hinting on. It's not a harm when we all realize that people in Vismin needs actual help and attention because the systemic systems allowed them to think that way. Before anything else, specific responses towards DPM. DPM is running the convenient case on only the Duterte politicians when the power is with the DDS supporters themselves. Go to Davao and Cotabato to see the massive support he has. Assuming these people are then rational, when they're not victims, you need to actively demonize them. DPM needs to understand, doesn't even say the word because they don't want to bite the bullet, that they need to villainize these individuals before they can villainize Duterte himself. Therefore then, despite the recognition of rationality, we are still Filipinos who are also humans who just want representation. It is not exclusive to opening government on making Duterte politicians like Bongo and Senator De La Rosa accountable, because the debate remains on ordinary Filipinos that currently exist. The nuance is whether or not we victimize these Filipinos at hand. Before anything else, rebuilding, why does what have we given you so far then? We said from Haleigh that the evil here is Rodrigo Duterte and his family members, considering Sara Duterte and the rest of his children, not your fellow Filipinos who were indoctrinated by the same systems that made our people poor systems that poor responses to calamities and plundering of government funds that they hid. The scale is more good because we were able to villainize an actor who did evil things to our people so that no Duterte will be elected again. It's not only about the pragmatic, but why principally Duterte is bad and his supporters are victims of his manipulation. 2 questions I'm going to answer. Why victimizing DDS has done more good, but letter B, how this strategy is better to reduce Duterte supporters while I answer my argumentation. This is to humanize the debate better because the preference and proximity towards Duterte made them prone to active manipulation due to the lack of education systems, lack of representation, and how the rhetoric of he will end drugs in 6 months because the previous administration failed to do so. People were tired and they saw a glimpse of hope from Duterte the same way Kakamping supporters saw a glimpse of hope in Leni Robredo. Victimizing them made Duterte the main target of villainization, not these people. Look at the argumentations from opening government. That is what they do. Why victimizing DDS then unveils the systemic social issues we push. This is the pragmatic impacts we get coming from Haleigh. It's in his remarks, in his sexual remarks, that promoted rape culture, where we demonize the embedded existence of misogyny that magnified men and women who are tolerant to his actions. But letter B, it was to victimize the OFWs because Duterte used them as poster citizens on progress of society. But it was with the taking credit of Bongo of the Malasakit program that pretended they helped the poor and the sick, even if it wasn't. It was the Ayuda system that Duterte normalized to give that people think when politicians give, they are automatically good politicians. In terms of weighing, I think the victimization made us realize that our system is rotten and that Duterte took advantage of it and hid it. Absent the victimization, the narrative is deflected towards the people, but we will hardly mobilize. But even the mobilization will be targeted towards changing the people, not changing the system. On extent, Duterte is so vile and evil because his family weaponized the use of Assalamu alaikum in every speech, thinking they put the Muslim first when the people in Mindanao are dying because of hunger. All because these identities are underrepresented in a Filipino government that never took a chance on Vismin people. On government, they give up on people, they leave them behind dying. For my second issue, yes, Lee.
Most of the poor were just targets of consenting elites like Bongo, like Bato de la Rosa, who rationally chose to target the poor. Are you not holding them accountable because you see them as victims?
That's why you should listen to the first response. I said that's not exclusive to opening government. I can say that Bongo and De La Rosa are rotten, but the people who supported them are the same victims of them. That is so different with the privilege that they currently have. Why then mobilization is better on our side? And this is where the opposition, the Philippine opposition, is better behaving. I think absent victimization, we overlook the DDS virus and instead of precautions, we just treat them with paracetamol. This is the mechanism to change voting behavior and even cut off their influence society. Look at what's happening. We're gaining progress because now we're uniting against Sara Duterte to run as president in 2028. People changed when they understood that the Duterte was the opposite of what he promised. That he did not end drug wars. He just did. He just killed drug addicts because the drug lords are actively partying in his mansion. The DDS in Philippines cry buckets of tears due to the parasocial relationship they created because they made him actively feel seen. When was the last time you heard Assalamu alaikum from an active politician in national government? It was probably the last video of Sara Duterte. It was not the fault of Mindanaoans that they spoke his language or that the Cebuanos spoke Bisaya just like he did. On weighing, the mobilization of the Duterte opposition on our side is better because we double down on fact-checking instead of making troll farms or saying that these individuals are bad. That student activists created projects for electoral education and go down on communities in Cebu province to Cotabato in order to neutralize what the propaganda pushed them to think. OG automatically loses and probably extend to CG because they agree that they are victims. It is soft class. CG should do better and say that DDS will become their enemies and that is what they will target. I think insofar as rebuilding in itself, the nuance in itself already explained to you that the context of the Philippines is likely going to prove to you that these individuals are victims. Unlike in Western societies like United States where these individuals have access to education, proper healthcare systems or others, because in the Philippines, they don't even have proper classrooms to be able to educate themselves. Our social studies are limited towards just understanding the dates of the histories happening, not explaining the importance of this and why it happened and birthed in the first place. But on to the last one, on accountability that is likely going to be skewed on the people. It is bad because you do not hold masterminds behind this, which is the Duterte camp, and they're able to repeat the cycle again with Sara. But you also view all of them as enemies, which actively antagonizes them. So you're unable to forward anti-Duterte rhetoric. We dare say that the people is the victim, and the victims supposed to be protected, and who needs to be accountable are the Duterte themselves. He can die in Hague.
Thanks for that speech, Deputy Leader of Opposition. That ends the opening exchange. Now to start the closing half, calling on member of COG here.
Okay. Okay, Parl wants shout out to Parl, shout out to Marie, shout out to Parish, also shout out to Lancy. Starting in 3. Authoritarian projects survive when their supporters can just say that they are misled and therefore they are not liable for the consequences of their actions. If the De-Dutertification is to mean anything, people must understand that endorsing punitive rule and oftentimes impunity is not costless. It requires accountability from the people, and therefore that accountability mechanism should exist in spaces like media. It should exist in spaces like schools. It should also exist in narratives in the policies that we create to make sure that the nightmare of another Duterte being in office will not happen. I'll first deal with the extension and prove why the extension weighs us above opening government already, and prove why the claim from opening opposition does not fly in this instance. First, the victimizations of the DDS often entrench the most atrocious norms around politics and how Filipinos interact with families, for example, and their legacy. The premise of this argument is very simple. The language that opening government used is the same rhetoric that extreme liberal used to demonize the DS, that these people have agency and consent to the way they supported Duterte. However, to the extent that there are politicians that exploit the circumstances of these people by manipulating information and establishing institutions that make it difficult for these people to even realize the fault that they have, closing government will be extremely charitable and engage in the frame that they are victims of circumstances, they are victims of manipulation from perverse institutions, and therefore do not have agency. Why then characterizing them as victims become an unsolvable problem inside opposition bench? I want to note that Duterte's drug war killed thousands of Filipinos who are mostly from poor and disadvantaged communities. This is a reprehensible crime that was emboldened because the Duterte camp believed that DDS will always have their back, and because their supporters will be excused because of a strong communal narratives in the Philippines. Why their victimization in the comparative is bad? Eloisa frame is correct that DDS and their messaging often exist in social media echo chambers that have little to no regulation. This is why you often see the worst versions of sentiments in these areas. But in that context, victimizing these supporters attaches moral value to their actions that often demand compassion and empathy. This is true because this is literally the frame of opening opposition, and there are three reasons why this often results to perverse consequences. First, it competes symbolically with the actual victims of state violence, and that removes public sympathy and attentions from the people who are victims by EJK. Secondly, it shifts attentions from the being complicit to EJK to being victims that often deserves reparations from the state through social welfare, for example, through demanding DSWD that the funding for mental health should be extended to these people. But lastly, it makes accountability narratives seem cruel or excessive precisely because it affects the mental health of the DDS bloggers and random hobo that support Duterte at this point. And this shows that victimizing these people creates an irreversible and often moral harm to people who are actually killed because of the shift in media priority, but also because of how the process of victimization often demands immediate compassion and empathy. Compassion is only genuine when there's an obvious remorse from these people. Insofar as opposition could not prove this, they cannot win this debate. Before I go on, CO.
So a lot of de-Dutertification efforts were initiated to benefit the Marcos administration disproportionately. How are you able to differentiate Marcos from Duterte on your side if you also condemn the Duterte supporters?
So we do not care if this is hijacked by the incumbent. We do not care if this is hijacked by other alternative parties like the liberals. What we care is that we demand accountability from these people, if insofar as this is hijacked by the incumbent to be able to exploit the narrative, to be able to de-Dutertify, for example, to embolden their own perverse personal and vested interests. That is fine, precisely because you can also create other alternative forms of expressions to be able to call out these people and call out the unfair structures that embolden them. How do Filipinos interact with social justice as an outcome of this victimization? Opening up relies on the convenient frame that these Duterte supporters are victims of circumstances, which deadlocks OG, by the way, which argued that these Duterte supporters are agentic. How do we break this deadlock? Is to simply illustrate how people now interact with this victimization. I would argue that citizens must believe that voting and normalizing political rhetoric should have consequences, and oftentimes these consequences should be hard and should be difficult for them to be able to escape from, for them to realize the full brunt of their actions. This analysis would explain that when one's supporters are primarily cast as victims, they are made to believe and conditioned that they did not have responsibility for the injustices that the real victims have incurred. There are three layers of analysis to prove that why this premise is true. First, they rely on the most proximate narratives that affirm and excuses their actions to be able to make sure that they do not have moral associations to the kinds of harms and narratives that they create. Secondly, it also incentivizes the incumbent and Duterte-related agency to be reactionary when these DDS feel like they're being attacked. This looks like anti-bullying policies are now being weaponized against victims who demand reparation from the DDS, or anti-privacy laws are weaponized against news agencies that illustrate the atrocious narratives within the Duterte echo chamber. This explanation is better than OG already, because Leah only adds as explaining that the opposition party will create resolution as an outcome, but we uniquely explain how the politicking now becomes convoluted and messy and only result to unruly conversation, which in and of itself a harm. But thirdly, even if they are manipulated, which concedes to the most charitable frame from closing opposition, that does not justify victimization, because manipulations and agency can often coexist. This looks like adults regularly making poor decisions under poor informations, or democratic culture still requiring reflective responsibility. For example, in many instances, if OP believes that we needed to extend empathy to these people, then they also create the narrative that every harmful political choices also become morally permissible on their side of the house. It's difficult for them to demand accountability in the future. It's difficult for the grassroots movement and NGOs to demand accountability from government institutions if the immediate reactions on their side is that they're going to excuse their fellow Filipinos. If this is a metric on their side, this is incongruent and therefore should not be credited, precisely because the same Filipino that you demand accountability from, like the Duterte, are also Filipino. This standard is inconsistent. Second, it also ignores the responsibility of institutions that allowed for the proliferations of perverse information that makes these people feel like they're agentic. So in OP, non-victimizing these supporters makes it difficult to hold not just these individuals, but also the media apparatus and agencies that benefits from this victimization. But lastly, being manipulated is just a convenient excuse that but also often a cultural signal to your neighbors to be able to sympathize for you. And this is bad, because humanizing their struggles, as Adi says, often takes away the attention to the actual victims, but also makes it easier for these people to generate sympathy and attention. That kind of energy should be diverted towards holding these people accountable, but also that energy should be directed towards making sure that our moral standards in the Philippines is consistent. For these reasons, very proud to propose. Thanks.
Thanks for that speech, member of government. Now to open the closing half clash, I'm all here.
Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. Luigi Hihemde. If you have any POIs, you could put it in the chat. I'll watch the chat for all of your POIs, and that should be good. A lot of Duterte supporters are victims of the drug war too, and yet they still are Duterte supporters because of one particular reason. It is because these de-Dutertification efforts are happening now in the present, and they are done under one particular administration, which Sara Duterte has co-opted as a victim of. This reason is important to win us the debate, because opening up, opening gov, closing gov are so fixated upon trying to blame Duterte and trying to pin the blame on Duterte and not on the victims and not on all of the supporters, when the narrative of DDS supporters isn't that case anyways. The narrative was as follows: that the specific reason why Duterte supporters feel emboldened now is because Sara Duterte has successfully co-opted the anti-Marcosian narrative of the opposition in a specific way. And there are three reasons why. Number one, because the anger and frustration of the flood control scandal was allegedly perpetrated by individuals at the top, which is easier to blame on Marcos, on Romualdez, which is why Marcoleta supporters and his attempts to try and bring the Marines all there are trying to implicate both opposition groups and also individuals that are pro-Marcos. And it's so convenient and so easy to do so because a lot of opposition groups are affiliated and are sympathetic with Marcos in the pursuit of trying to kick out Duterte. Number two, because this is because of the alleged ability for them to try and kidnap Duterte and his supporters and also his co-conspirators and bring them to The Hague as a means to try and rile up nationalism, which was something that Duterte rode on when he first began, right? Like a lot of progressive left individuals rode on this anti-imperialist narrative, this pro-nationalist support under Duterte, because again, it led to the centralization of pro-Marcos power, the pro-Marcos cabinet, and the Senate majority. Think of the Remulla brothers, the undermining of justice, how it looks like it's just a sham investigation in the Senate and the Congress. This frustration is latent, it is strong, but only benefits Sara. But lastly, this is because in the next few years, and this is independent of anything else in the debate, economic problems of the PH would likely be attributed mostly to the Marcos regime the most, and all of the other affiliates of the Marcos regime, like, for example, many people that would end up supporting in a coalition with Marcoses against the Dutertes, which is why the nostalgia for the Duterte recovery period under COVID, which wasn't Duterte's fault, by the way, it happened because every economy around the world was recovering and we got more jobs in the Philippines, that will be attributed to the Duterte regime, which is why nostalgia is much more stronger on their side. I want to be very clear. I'm not supporting Marcos, but if you believe that Duterte supporters right now ever consider Risa or Bam or whatever, they won't, because they believe they're complicit in the rise of Marcos and the fall of Duterte because they are victims of the Marcos regime. This is what we want to talk about in this debate. My argument is quite simple. The process of portraying Duterte supporters as victims improves our institutional efforts, which are coalitional and are easier for us to push if it were not otherwise blocked by Duterte supporters. Now, if you look at all the reasons I just gave you earlier, like the reason why there are a big flood control scandal that's rooted in political dynasties, it rooted in how different families are able to centralize power in different districts in a fat or different institutional way by controlling different segments of power, like the Remulla brothers, for example. Or, for example, if you look at how different administrations have hijacked economic policy by installing technocrats, for example, and undermining the ability of different participation groups to participate, for example. All of these things are rooted in compromises that Duterte supporters are willing to agree on, especially if it is anti-Marcos. But we believe that portraying them as victims does the following in doing this. And this is the most important argument in this debate, because some of these institutional representations, like, right now, they might temporarily benefit Marcos, but they won't benefit Marcos forever, right? De-Dutertification efforts don't necessarily only harm Duterte. They will eventually also harm people like Marcos as well. Like, for example, the anti-political dynasty bill, which is currently in the Senate and Congress, but is currently being blocked by a lot of supporters of Duterte who believe that it is being targeted against his particular family because they're the most publicized political family that has been put on the news for corruption, like the vice presidency scandal and the impeachment scandal, which is being targeted against her and her family and Davao City's, affiliation and their love for their supreme leader and all of these things, which harm the sympathy of that family. Again, the narrative of this is uniquely tied to this political dynasty, uniquely tied to the rise of this particular family, and that victimhood is hijacked by their supporters in a particular way that undermines oppositional efforts so that no reform is passed at all. We think a lot of these supporters would otherwise be sympathetic because it is much easier to downplay the credit of Duterte because he wasn't in power. It was Marcos who was in power in the last few years. Most of these corruption efforts can be attributed to him and his cronies because of the fact that he's boshing this investigation. The second thing I want to look at, apart from the flood control scandal and making our institutional representation better there through the anti-political dynasty bill, we believe that having more efforts to consolidate support for including witness testimonies, statements from Duterte supporters, from the media, for example, putting them on media, allowing them to say their feelings and grievances as part of the regime, and both the Marcos regime and the Duterte regime, right? To an extent, it undermines opposition's efforts to try and discredit Duterte entirely because you blame Marcos subtly, but on the long run, it includes the process of having more coalitional state-level compensation for the drug war for all families in Davao City, because all families were affected, not just not anti-Duterte supporters, but Duterte supporters as well. But the refusal of such makes every investigation, every media portrayal by Rappler more politicized on the comparative because you don't include them. Now, the echo chambers reinforce further, and this is a more closer mechanism as to why polarization is more permanent and more long-lasting to the benefit of Sara, in a better way than how opening opposition does it in the debate. Having said that, opening gov, if you have one first, opening gov.
The compromise that comes with this victimhood is still bad because you still disallow justice towards individuals that died from these policies. We would note that supporters still benefit from a lot of these policies. They are still morally culpable.
Okay, that's great. I'm happy with this debate now. This debate is much clearer to me. I believe that this is important for a few reasons under our model. Because one, these efforts are institutional, right? So making the Congress and Senate more representative across all party lines, not just having a coalitional party that is pro-Marcos or sympathetic to the Marcos regime, reduces the ability for them to have party hopping, for example, in the long run, which is why both dynasties are not able to benefit in a disproportionate way. For the drug victims and all their families, we believe the ICC project, right? Like that's going to continue independent of any investigation or whatever media or Rappler publishes, right? This is about the portrayal of victimhood. So whatever Rappler does, if they do it on our side in a better way that is more representative of everyone, including Duterte supporters, how they've been betrayed or how they believe that they are victims of the regime, of both regimes, then they buy in because our compromise works. It is institutional, it is long-term. We get this sympathy in a better, more inclusive way. We gave you all of these mechanisms that are more independent and concrete, and I gave you the context that is better. We win.
Thanks for that speech, member of opposition. Now to close the case and government bench, calling on government whip. Here. Again, Gov whip. I saw you opening your microphone, but I can't hear anything. Maybe try reconnecting. Hello, can you try speaking? Yeah, we can't hear you. Can someone confirm as well from the panel or from anyone that you can't hear the speaker as well? Hello, can someone confirm as well that it's not only my problem? All right, so it's not a me problem. It seems that all right. Um, do what you can. We'll wait for you. I think GovWeb is trying to reconnect through different device or through the someone. Hello, just to check, is government up here now? Cap or anyone from OC, there's an issue here. Government whip wants to switch to Discord because I think they're having technical difficulties with their microphone. Can someone from Cap or OC um do the protocol on what?
Yep, I think that's fine. You could move to Discord.
All right, so everyone, let's move to Discord. Room 1. Thank you.
Hello?
And hello, am I audible? I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Okay.
So yes, you're audible right now.
Okay, thank you. Is everybody here so I can start my speech now?
Hold on, I'm going to do roll call first. OG, you guys here? My complete. OG? Is OG here and complete? OO.
We're here.
Alright, posting opposition. Is closing opposition here and complete?
Present.
Alright, Judge Bryan.
Here.
Alright, thank you. Sid.
Here.
Alright, Judge Joaquin.
Here.
Alright, and Judge Jovhenn.
Here.
Alright, how about OG again? OG, are you guys here? Opening government, are you guys here? Alright, I think they're not here yet, so I don't think you can start. Hold on. Cap and OC, should we wait for OG? Hello, Cap, anyone from OC? Should we wait for OG before closing opposition start? I mean, closing of whip.
Yeah, I think we should.
Alright,
But yeah, can any of the intimate of OG call them to enter the room?
I've messaged.
OG is here.
Oh, Leah's here. Nice.
Alright, I think they're here. I think we're complete as well. Whip, anytime.
Okay. Let's start immediately. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. The efforts of De-Dutertification are likely to be hindered and likely to be upended on the side of opposition when you evade accountability for these people, when you start at the point that you try to start patronizing them because you frame them as victims. A few responses to OO. Because the first thing they say is that on their side, you don't demonize them for their circumstances in their world. We agree that on their side, they're probably not going to demonize them because the nature of victimization probably means that you don't demonize them. But why is the way that this becomes communicated due to Duterte supporters become much more harmful for De-Dutertification? Simply put, it's the fact that they're going to feel patronizing them. That's simply the fact that you're going to patronize them. They're going to feel like they're being patronized at the point that you call them victims, because necessarily the way that you you're going to communicate it to them is that you tell them that they were ignorant of their circumstances, that they couldn't decide for themselves in that situation, that they had no agency, that they weren't rational, and that they didn't make these choices willingly because of the evil that is Duterte. And this is exactly harmful because because it is through this process where you communicate to them that they're victims, that you invalidate their experiences and choices, which makes things personal, especially considering their dislike for the parties that are likely going to spout the victimization to them, such as the left party, such as the liberal party, right? Which means that it's not just that people disengage, as OO suggests. It is that they begin to spread narratives about the left, about the liberals, that they're being elitist, and that the Duterte supporters should continue to go against them because the oppositional party is necessarily invalidating their experiences by saying that they were victims and that they had no agency in their situations. They don't just disengage; they actively try to resist and strengthen. They actively try to resist and strengthen their belief in Duterte, which harms De-Dutertification because they become much more stubborn, they become much more stoic against what the oppositional parties are trying to convince them. For comparatively on our side, it is much better. And this is where I go and respond to their second argument on why the counterfactual on our side is necessarily going to be demonizing, right? Because note that this is simply untrue that on our side we're going to demonize them, right? Note that through Addy's argument, liberals will in the long term recognize that demonization doesn't work in convincing supporters that Duterte was bad. What this means is that in the long term, the left probably wants to de-Dutertify in a way. In a way that cuts back on the harassment, but in a way that is still critical. So it's not in a way that victimizes them, right? But it's in a way that considers that they are rational, that they had the agency to make these choices. But at the same time, you say that what they did was exactly wrong with these. You say exactly what was wrong with these choices, but not in a way that is to the extent that parang you extremely demonize them, right? It is simply a much more objective and much more factual way in which it's likely to manifest on government, and it's through this method that the Duterte supporters are likely going to be a lot more receptive to looking at themselves critically, to looking at Duterte in a bad light, because of course you're not demonizing with this thing that I just responded with. So you just plainly cite that a lot of you also plainly cite that a lot of things that they wanted to happen with the Duterte administration didn't happen the way that they wanted to, but you don't demonize them for it, right? And the way that this manifests in status quo is that this looks like people within the leftist parties telling people that their methods of like harassing or demonizing supporters probably isn't working, so you probably want to switch to more methods that aren't as demonizing, which is why the methods on our side is much comparatively better, because even in the case that people won't be convinced by us, no matter what method you choose, that's okay, because at least the method of not victimizing them and being more objective won't be patronizing or demonizing, which draws more people away on opposition side. But all this means is that op side gets a lot less supporters on their side, because you necessarily alienate them by patronizing them, by telling them that they have no agency, as opposed to our side, which is much more charitable to them. Sure, POI.
Closing.
Oo. Wait, opening or closing?
Closing.
Okay, so the impeachment complaint against Sarah makes it personal when it implicates her supporters for being complicit in promoting corruption. Isn't it better to promote institutional efforts of De-Dutertification that will harm Marcos in the short run so that we can weaken Sarah's immediate influence?
Wait, I'll explain later why you're not likely to get the support from Duterte supporters either way in your world, right? But just moving on to finishing off, the reason why you don't get mobilization, as their second speaker says, is because this is also the reasons why I just said is also the reason why you don't mobilize people on OO side. Because even if you reveal the reasons as to why they're being victims, the patronizing way in that it is likely to be delivered will lock people out from listening to you anyways. Additionally, people just never feel accountable for what they did, as Addy says. They don't feel like it was their fault. They don't feel like it was their responsibility, which means that you get less participation from them because they don't feel responsible for the actions that they did when they chose Duterte. The way that you weigh us over OO is simply to say that which Addy explains is that you invalidate on our side. On our side, you're not going to how do you weigh Addy against OO, right? It's because you don't invalidate from the actual victims, such as the EJK victims, such as people being rectad, as Addy explains. Because Addy explains that the accountability on these Duterte supporters is lost with the victimization, which means that you lose support from the left and from the actual victims of Duterte, which is harmful for De-Dutertification, because you're necessarily going to lose support from a lot of the left and from a lot of like the EJK victims and red tagging victims, simply because you're deriving accountability away from the supporters who necessarily allowed those harms to happen to them in the first place. It is also true because it's also more true. This is also more true because now the left or the victims cannot speak out against the Duterte supporters who promoted the harmful practices against them in the first place, because the victimization tells them that these people had no agency, so you can't hold them accountable. Additionally, the moral permissibility that Adi mentions prevents supporters from caring about the consequences that they've done, so they don't feel bad, they don't change, and they still try to support things like authoritarian policies because they don't feel necessarily responsible for what happened with Duterte. This is where I get to responding to CG, right? So they say that's going to improve institutional efforts, but this is contingent on Duterte supporters buying into things such as like the witness claims or things such as investigations if you victimize them as a form of compromise. The problem with this is that aside from you or the inherently patronizing them with the victimization, which means that they're probably not going to buy into CG anyway, they will not feel like participating, because even though that you're trying to victimize them in order to come to a sort of compromise that allows them to participate in things such as institutional reform, they still feel like they're being hedged against. They feel like things are still being hedged against them because the victimization happens at the hands of the parties that they're necessarily opposed against, such as the left, such as oppositional parties, right? So even if you're trying to victimize them in order to get them to participate into institutional reforms, they're not going to buy into it because it is at the hands of the party that they're necessarily opposed to, right? Why do we weigh over CG? Simply put, it's for much for the same reasons why we weigh over OO. It's simply because on our side, not only are you able to likely get more support from the test supporters because you're not demonizing, as I earlier explained in the response, but it's also because of the fact that you also keep support within your own parties because you're able to hold these people accountable at the same time, which necessarily means that you get more things towards the De-Dutertification. And that ends my speech. Sorry for all the inconveniences.
Thanks for that speech, Gov Whip. So, Cap, should we stay here? And OC?
Yep, you should.
Okay, thank you so much. And lastly, to wrap up this debate, calling on Upweb. You're here. Again, calling Upweb to end this debate.
Do I start over?
He's in the G meet. Oh, my bad. Hold on.
Hello, Upweb, are you here?
I think she started her speech at the G meet, so I'm just messaging her.
All right.
Yeah,
thank
I
you.
already informed her about that. She's transferring to Discord.
Okay, all right. Sorry, guys.
Oh, hello.
Hello, yes, sir, Audible. Anytime.
Oh, okay, I'll leave the Gmail. I'm so sorry for that.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, so pronouns she, her, PLI preferences voice, and like my only shout out is to Luigi. Thank you for ProAming with me. And like go Ateneo, one big fight. Starting in my first word. This debate is about De-Dutertification. It is only Luigi's speech that properly contextualizes the existing barriers to promoting De-Dutertification, whilst OO was disproportionately caught up in trying to blame the Duterte regime without showing how they would specifically do it through portraying Duterte supporters as victims. On our side, we portray them as victims through a few key mechanisms, which includes more diverse coalitions and inclusion to Duterte sympathizers in moderate parties to pass the anti-political dynasty bill, and in pursuing institutional reforms that are more long-lasting, like the efforts to make the flood control scandal investigations more representative and more broad-based. Let me clarify again what our side thinks is actually the real problem. The problem is that Sara Duterte co-opted the anti-Marcos narrative as a uniquely targeted effort. So the reason why we win this debate is because we prevent the rise of Sara Duterte. We prove that the process of portraying them as victims and treating them sympathetically stops Sara Duterte from being able to co-opt this narrative and act as a martyr or like a rally rallying figure that will rescue them from Marcos' persecution, therefore creating the most effective counterbalance, which is converting these people into supporters of Duterte opposition. So now let's respond to all the other teams and compare it against that. OG then is reliant on trying to understand the victims. On OG's own mechanism, they knife their own case by showing how portraying them as victims of Duterte leads to more understanding and reform, which means, therefore, that their own argument is proving that this narrative actually does more good than harm, which is the exact opposite of their burden. What our extension does in relation to proving that the process of characterizing Duterte supporters as victims gives them the opportunity to change their minds and switch sides, leading to improved, more effective efforts towards institutional reforms that these supporters would otherwise oppose. So the main thing that differentiates us from OO then is that they have too much they are creating too much negativity against Duterte alone. They also don't bother to flesh out their substantive case. They only go so far as to say that Duterte supporters are going to switch sides, but don't really bother to impact this further. CO then goes further and deeper by proving that the process of recognizing these supporters as victims weaponizes the negative narratives that currently exist against Marcos, that he is persecuting them for their beliefs in a way that is actually good for institutional reforms, not for the entirety of the Philippines. That is why we win this debate. Bringing back OG then, what do they give us? They specifically point out that another reason to their many lists of reasons why supporters should not be seen as victims is the fact that many of them were privileged, powerful politicians, and these are the rot in our society that need to be held accountable. CG, on the other hand, gives a vertical extension that relies on OG's frame by telling you that demonizing these supporters leads to accountability, and that accountability leads to them being able to get reparations for the real victims. And so, we will respond to this by asking you one specific question. In the entire history of the Philippines, have any politicians actually been held accountable for their shameless greed and abuse of the Filipino people? The answer is no. So the only way then that you can credit CG's argument is if you believe that the current political deadlock between the Duterte and Marcos faction that is undoubtedly going to intensify if you keep demonizing the Duterte faction is suddenly going to disappear, and that the hostility of the politicians who were prosecuted even more intensely is suddenly going to disappear. They do not have the requisite middle analysis to prove solvency on their side. Our extension addresses this by doing the following. So when you treat supporters, especially the politicians who still have political power as victims, you don't force them into a corner and make them double down on supporting Duterte. Even on the off chance that somehow they manage the Marcos faction somehow manages to subdue them completely, the fact that many of them are still in sitting positions and hold power means that they are going to put up a tough fight that will just drain resources that could go towards actual institutional reform. I'll take that POI.
So the way to the victimization is not to strengthen privacy laws and repeal anti-terror law, but to be reactionary by campaigning against the people who demand accountability from this fact-checking. How do you guarantee that political energy will be invested towards protecting the people who try to build anti-violence norms?
Okay, I'll actually go to that later, but okay, so by giving them the chance to preserve their own self-interest and abandon the sinking ship that is Duterte, you do three things. One, you get them to support, and you create coalitional support for the anti-political dynasty bill, which even if Marcos is going to be a victim of that, he can't directly suppress that without looking obviously corrupt. So he's going to let it pass, and even if that doesn't work immediately, it creates more opportunities in the future to enact some sort of actual institutional change. The second thing that you do then is that you create support for collecting witness testimonies and statements from Duterte supporters in the processing of state-level compensation for the drug war to families in Davao City. So if that is what CG is trying to win on, then we do it better than them, because it is only on our side that you get enough bipartisan or overall political capital in order to get this done. Third then is the inclusion of members from PDP Laban into moderate coalitions and party list groups and efforts towards impeachment and accountability for flood control investigations. So realize then, at the end of, even if this doesn't comprehensively solve all of the problems in politics, getting these bills passed takes us one step closer to holding the people on both sides accountable. Because on their side, what you are arguably going to do is, if you don't try reaching out to the victims in the first place, to the supporters and treating them sympathetically in the first place, they're still going to stay in that position because you're not giving them any chance to feel like they're welcome on your side. So at the end of the day, if nothing happens in the Senate and the Congress, then the only person that benefits is going to be Marcos and his cronies, because they are never going to be properly investigated for corruption. And also, onto something that CG said, are they trying to, they're trying to say that we're going to do this in a patronizing way. But no, that's not actually the case, because what Duterte's, the easiest compromise is if we actually treat them like normal people, and that's the most likely thing we think is going to happen on our side. For all these reasons, Brad do oppose.
All right, thank you so much, Upweb, and I think that ends the grand finals of Visayas ProAm 2026. Congratulations, everyone. You will now cross the house. Please give us time to deliberate amongst ourselves and reach a decision. Congratulations. Please move on now to the convening. Judges,
Thank you so
please
much.
be with me on adjudicator's room. Thank you.
so much.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye bye.